Right, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. A significant preponderance of men here this evening, I notice. I think it might be something about the fact that artillery isn't a ladies' subject, but isn't usually a ladies' subject. Anyway, you will notice that Nick refers to the Waterloo Letter. You will understand later how that links to the artillery at Waterloo, and indeed you will understand already if you read the flyer before the event. Anyway, I'm particularly pleased to welcome Colonel Nick Lipscombe here tonight, a gunner, so it can be assumed, I hope correctly, that he knows about guns and being a gunner. And he also knows one hell of a lot more about what happened during the Peninsular War and at Waterloo than I will ever know. And his expertise as a cartographer, drawing maps of the Peninsular War and of Waterloo, is evident in the museum. In fact, many of the maps, all the maps I think you see in the Waterloo Gallery, were prepared by Nick. Anyway, enough said. We're going to hear about the Waterloo Letter and the artillery at Waterloo. Nick has eschewed a microphone because he said he's got a loud voice. I'm going to sit at the back, and if I can't hear a bloody word, I shall be brassed off. I was going to say something else, but I will be brassed off. Nick, the floor is yours.
Christopher, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. The Waterloo Letter. Now, this rather magnificent, atmospheric, certainly, painting by Christopher Collingwood depicts G Troop of the Royal Horse Artillery at about 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the 18th of June. 3 hours later, the troop, which had been in action now for a full 8 hours and had also been in action the day prior during the withdrawal from Quatre Bras to the position of Mont Saint-Jean, had been virtually annihilated. Now, there are few who really have studied the Battle of Waterloo who could not fail but agree with an assertion made by a recent historian, Jack Weller, in about 1960s. He said that Wellington's artillery did more for him at Waterloo than any other battle. And, as I say, when you study the battle, you couldn't fail to agree. One man, however, most certainly didn't agree. And that was the very architect of that magnificent Allied victory at Waterloo that day, Wellington. For he was to write 6 months after the battle, on the 21st of December 1815, from his headquarters in Paris, where he was commanding the armies of occupation, to Earl Mulgrave, the Master General of the Ordnance. And then you can see that was his sort of opening gambit to the letter. He then went on to make 4 separate accusations in the letter. The first was that the gunners had failed to keep an adequate reserve of artillery. The second, that they had conducted counter-battery fire, that is to fire on the French batteries, contrary to his orders, his direct orders. Thirdly, that they had failed to seek refuge within, and that's a key word, the infantry squares, particularly during the cavalry attacks, is what he meant. And then finally, the ultimate coup de grace is that they had quit the field completely. Now, how was this that the relationship really between Wellington and his gunners had reached such a low point? Had the gunners served Wellington badly since his meteoric rise as the most junior Lieutenant General in the British Army in August 1808 through to and including the Battle of Waterloo in 1815? Or were there a number of other factors at play? Well, in order to understand this, we need to look at how the army was structured at the start of the 19th century and how the gunners fitted into that structure. there were, and this is a point often misunderstood, 3 fighting components to that army: the infantry, the cavalry, and the artillery. And the skill of a great Napoleonic general was how he would weave those 3 components together on the field of battle to achieve his tactical and then subsequently his operational objectives. Now that's straightforward enough, but it's very interesting how many Peninsular War historians have confused that fact. They have considered the gunners a combat support arm, which they weren't until the beginning of the 20th century and the start of the First World War. Or, worse still, they've ignored the gunners altogether. And it's curious in my research that no French historian has made the same mistake when looking at the French army during the French the Revolutionary Wars or the Grande Armée during the Napoleonic Wars. But there is actually a fairly straightforward and simple explanation for this. And you can't see this clearly, I realise that, so I'll talk through the slide. But this is, or was, the command and administration of the British Army at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. We've got 4 stovepiped organisations which had the responsibility for the army. And to understand why this was the case, we have to go back to the 17th century, to Cromwell and his new model army. Having been created in support of Parliament to confront the Crown, which it succeeds in doing, it then turns its attention to Parliament itself. Well, this results in a constitutional antipathy and a deep-seated societal prejudice against the armed forces, which then pervades throughout the 18th century. There is a struggle as to who is going to retain control of the army, and it's really vested during that period in civil hands, while military officers are restricted to matters of a purely professional nature. And it results in this, what can only be described as an absolute shambles by the start of the Napoleonic Wars. If we go through these 4 groups, we've got on the left the Treasury, headed up, of course, by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he's got responsibility, not surprisingly, through the Paymaster General for matters financial. But he's also got, and his department has got, responsibility for the Commissariat. And what these dotted lines show is strategic political, through the operational, down to the tactical level. When we come to the tactical level in the field, we've got the Commissariat transport and stores for the army. Okay, but then let's move on. Let's come next to the War Office. We've got the Secretary of State for War, established in 1794, a year after the French Revolutionary Wars kick off. And this post here, cabinet post, but he's triple-hatted. So he really hasn't got the time to turn his attention to the day-to-day administration and running and policy and planning, which is really what the War Office had responsibility for the army. And so he uses the Secretary at War, not a political post, and a post that's been in existence indeed since the 17th century as well. And they have responsibility collectively, in addition to policy and planning for the army, with all things medical. Now we come to Horse Guards, the third of those organisations. The titular head of the British Army was the monarch. But in crisis and war, the responsibility, the day-to-day responsibility as C&C of the army really was not something that the monarch was going to be able to turn his attention to and provide the requisite amount of support. And so, in crisis and war, a C&C at Horse Guards was put into place. It just so happened in 1794, this was Frederick, the Duke of York, the King's youngest son. And there's no doubt the Duke of York did a really superb job He was in that position throughout, from 1794 through until at the end of the Battle of Waterloo, with the exception of a couple of years in the middle, 1809 and 1810. Now, he was C&C to the British Army, but he didn't have the whole of the British Army. He had two of those fighting components, i.e. the infantry and the cavalry. For the third fighting component comes into this organisation here on the left of the screen, the Board of Ordnance. Now, the Board of Ordnance was set up in 1544 under the reign of Henry VIII, and its task initially was to provide cannons or other forms of ordnance and small arms and the requisite ammunition for all of those to the Navy. And then subsequently, the Army ordnance was included. It also had a responsibility for matters engineer and fortifications. It was headed up by the Master General of the Ordnance, and by 1793, although it was a military man that was holding the post, it was a civilian post, and it fell on the fall of a government. It was replaced on the fall of a government. The Master General of the Ordnance and the board had responsibility for the selection, the training, and the appointment of all of the officers in the Royal Artillery and in the Royal Engineers. Now, if we just look briefly, if we go back to another wiring diagram, have a look at Command and Administration of the Royal Navy at the same time. There are many military people in this room, and for us, we're much more comfortable with a wiring diagram that looks like this than the previous one, because the whole thing filters through a single organ, the Admiralty here. And even the Board of Ordnance, which of course has responsibility for the guns, has been much more seamlessly integrated into this command and administrative system. The Navy, of course, the Royal Navy, doesn't pose a threat to Parliament. Now, if we add one more organisation to this already very busy wiring diagram, the Home Office and the Home Secretary, because he had responsibility for the militia and the volunteers, you can see that this is a nonsense. It would be extremely difficult in peacetime, but simply ruinous in war. It led to divided loyalties and absurd frustrations, and nowhere was that felt more acutely than the Royal Artillery, who had in effect three masters to serve. They had the Master General of the Ordnance, the C&C of the Army, and also they had the C&C in the field. And for the most of this period, of course, that was Wellington. And this is Wellington down here as the tactical/operational commander. He had to put his arms around this whole lot and make it work. And it was really tough. Wellington despised really the men that operated under these separate cloaks, particularly those serving the Board of Ordnance. And as the war in the Peninsula progressed, Wellington's criticisms of the artillery waxed. Interestingly, didn't increase or wax so much about the engineers, but that's a separate issue. But his recognition of the artillery's achievements in his post-battle dispatches most certainly waned. Now, moving on then to the battle at Waterloo. The commander, Royal Artillery, or the CRA at Waterloo, was this man, Colonel Sir George Wood. And he was a very capable officer. But he wasn't an officer of Wellington's choosing. And so it was a relationship doomed from the outset. And before the mud in the fields, Mont Saint-Jean had actually dried out, George Wood had fallen foul of Wellington. And Wood was to write to Dixon, who was a former CRA of Wellington's in the Peninsula, and a man that Wellington had personally elevated to the post, despite there being 6 other officers in theatre who were more senior than him. But he writes to Dixon, and Dixon's actually at Waterloo. Funnily enough, he'd arrived 2 days before the battle, came back from the debacle at New Orleans, but it wasn't enough time for Wellington to be able to arrange to replace Wood. Had he have had more time, I have no doubt that he would have tried to replace him. But Wood writes to Dixon, he says, "My sun is set, and I shall ask to return to England, having received the most severe reprimand before the whole staff and servants for not bringing off the artillery taken by us, but more when we meet." And it's lovely to be able to state that quote with Ernest Croft's picture here of the French captured artillery. Of course, the infantry and the cavalry had gone on in the pursuit, but of course the artillery were then expected to follow up and rein in and capture all of the French ordnance that largely had been left on the field. And obviously Wood didn't do that to Wellington's satisfaction. Notwithstanding all of this, however, the fact remains that Wellington's difficult and stormy relationship with his gunners, and particularly during Waterloo, would have paled into insignificance had it not been, or faded from memory, perhaps is a better description, had it not been for this Waterloo letter which he wrote 6 months after the battle. It doesn't actually become public knowledge, this letter, although certain people in certain circles were obviously aware of it in 1815 and early 1816, but it's not in the public domain until 1872, when it is published as part of the Second Duke's supplementary letters and dispatches at that time. And the letter, when it hit the stands, of course, rekindled the debate and reopened old wounds. But what motivated Wellington to write the letter in the first instance? Well, in order to understand this, we have to go back to June 1813 and the Battle of Vittoria. After that battle, the Master General of the Ordnance, Earl Mulgrave, petitioned the Prince Regent asking for recognition for the gunner officers that had fought at the battle. And Prince Regent duly acceded to the request, and the information came down to the field. Now, Wellington knew nothing of this, and he was apoplectic with rage. He considered this, and I would certainly agree with him, disruptive to force cohesion. The fact that one of his fighting components was able to go behind his back and seek recognition for their achievements in a battle, over and above, of course, what he'd written in his post-battle dispatch. And therefore, when following Waterloo, the officers of the artillery petitioned the Master General of the Ordnance, still Lord Mulgrave, to do the same thing and petition the Prince Regent again on their behalf. Mulgrave is unsure how to proceed, because at Vittoria all of the batteries were engaged in the battle, whereas at Waterloo a number were dislocated out to the west. And so he writes to Wellington to seek his guidance on the matter. Well, Wellington is absolutely determined to kill the idea stone dead, and that's what the Waterloo letter most certainly achieved. Well, what of the letter itself and the accusations therein? Well, the first accusation is that had he, in other words Wellington, not kept a reserve at the commencement of the battle, that there would have been none available at the back end of the day. Well, this is a slightly strange observation and certainly an odd accusation. For Wood and Colonel Augustus Fraser, who was commanding the Royal Horse Artillery at Waterloo, and who Wellington used really as his principal artillery advisor that day at the expense of Wood, most certainly had allocated sufficient reserve in terms of batteries prior to the battle. Now this sketch here, again, you won't be able to see this, but this is the Allied line along the ridge at Mont Saint-Jean and the French position, Belle Alliance, running around the south of Hougoumont. And you can see the batteries all laid out here, and this is the batteries as I perceive them to be, having done a reasonably extensive amount of research, let's put it like that. And there were 5 batteries that weren't deployed at the time. 3 of them were horse artillery batteries, Mercer's, Ramsay's, Bull's battery, and then 2 King's German Legion batteries of Bourne and Sinclair. However, such was the pace of events of the battle, is that actually those 5 batteries, and you can see them coming out here with these lines here, that by 1400 hours, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, those 5 batteries had been used up. Indeed, Wellington had deployed 2 of them personally himself. And consequently, at 4 p.m, and the commencement of the French cavalry attacks, when he turns to Fraser and says, "Bring up the reserve artillery," of course there was none to bring. Now this tells us 2 things, I think. First of all, it tells us that Wellington really wasn't aware of how much he'd already used the artillery, but of course he had so much going through his mind that day that we can certainly forgive him that. But it also tells us that there was a problem with the artillery chain of command. And there is no doubt in my research of Wellington's guns, it's very difficult to work out exactly who was really in charge of the artillery that day, because remember, we weren't just talking about the British batteries, the field and the horse artillery. We're also talking about King's German Legion batteries, Belgian batteries, Brunswick batteries, Hanoverian batteries, and so on. So how orders were disseminated is unclear, and there are certainly cases where some batteries just had not received the orders that Wellington had anticipated that they had received. Now, you could also argue that these batteries up here, which are Pettit and Gay, 2 batteries, and these 2 batteries here, which belong to Moll and Heinemann, 2 Brunswick and 2 Belgian batteries, also, because this depicts the situation at about 1500, they were also in reserve for most of the day. 29 batteries in total, of which you take those 5 that I spoke about at the beginning, you add these 4, that's 9 of the 29. That's a third, and that's pretty much the standard for a reserve. So actually, to be honest, as an accusation, it is both strange and unfair. What about the second accusation? The fact that the gunners had conducted counter-battery fire contrary to Wellington's direct order. Well, we have Cavalier Mercer's rather boastful account that he did this very thing and did engage French batteries. And this is what he said. "About this time, being impatient of standing idle and annoyed by the batteries on the Nivelle road, I ventured to commit a folly for which I should have paid dearly had our Duke chanced to be in our part of the field. I ventured to disobey orders and open a slow deliberate fire at the battery, thinking with my 9-pounders soon to silence his 4-pounders. My astonishment was great, however, when our first gun was responded to by at least half a dozen gentlemen of very superior calibre, whose presence I'd not even suspected, and whose superiority we immediately recognised by their rushing noise and long reach, for they flew far beyond us. I instantly saw my folly and ceased firing, and they did the same." And we also have evidence in the letters to Siborne that a number of other batteries also conducted counter-battery fire. We know that Bull's battery did, Sandham's battery, and Bolton's battery also engaged in the firing on French units, artillery units. And Bull wrote to Siborne, "The guns on our right were galling us extremely. I directed Lieutenant Louis to turn his 2 guns towards them, and we shortly succeeded in silencing them, which, as they enfiladed our position from the right, was of considerable advantage to us during the remainder of the day." So you can see that actually Bull had considerable mitigation in opening up counter-battery fire on a battery that was engaging him. Slip back to this and show you where Bull was down here, and this French battery was over here, so it was firing envelope into the side of his battery. So he got Lieutenant Louis to turn 2 guns and fire at them and stop them firing. And there's no doubt that both Bolton and Sandham had considerable mitigation as well. But that's not the point. The point really here is that that was a direct order by the Commander-in-Chief, and they chose to ignore it. So as an accusation, it is a fair accusation. Let's move on now to the 3rd and 4th accusations, because they're linked in that Wellington accused the gunners of not taking refuge within the squares, and that's that key word which we'll come back to, and, as I say, the ultimate insult to the gunners, that they ran off the field, taking with them limbers, ammunition, and everything, unquote. Now, these have been emphatically refuted by the gunners and gunner historians and a number of other historians for the last 140 years. 140 years because, of course, that's when the letter surfaced in 1870. So 445 years nearly now. But my research shows that there may be grounds for both of these accusations. Now, the order itself was ambiguous, to say the least, and it was poorly transmitted. And that again raises more questions about the gunner chain of command than it does about anything else. Fraser, when he wrote to Siborne, and Siborne's letters were put together about 15, 16 years after the battle, was quite clear that Wellington's order was that the gunners should seek refuge within the squares, and that's exactly the word that Wellington had used. And that serves to reinforce the closeness that Fraser had as the commander of the Horse Artillery, riding around and obviously being able to spend brief periods with the Commander-in-Chief on the field of battle during the day. But Lieutenant Bloomfield, who was on the staff, was absolutely adamant that the order went out saying that the gunners had to get out of the reach of the French cavalry, a completely different order. And yet others were clear that the source stated that they were to seek refuge behind the squares. Now, we know that some gunners did seek refuge within the squares, some within the lee of the squares, some stayed at their guns for good reasons, which were both understandable in the heat of battle, and yet others quit the field, as I will now hopefully be able to convince you. But leaving aside of who went where, who said what, and who did what, just how practical was this order in reality? And so we understand what we're talking about here in terms of a gun and the associated bits and pieces, the ammunition, limbers, and so on. You can see here, this is a horse artillery gun, and this is a foot artillery gun. And just to talk you through this, you can see the gun here, and that's the gun limber. The immediate first supply ammunition to the gun is held in that box, and it's being pulled in this case by 6 horses, but I'll come back to that in a minute. And you can see the gun numbers that service the gun here on horseback behind. For a field gun, same sort of thing, the immediate gun limber here with the gun, the difference being that the chaps are on foot. Now, we know that nearly all the batteries had 9-pounder guns, so that in fact meant they didn't have 6 guns on the limber or 6 guns pulling the first line artillery ammunition limbers, but 8. So an even more bigger footprint and logistic nightmare. We can reckon if we remove the first line ammunition limbers and horses, that we've still got servicing the 6 guns in a battery or a horse artillery troop. I say 6 guns, it's 6 pieces of ordnance actually. It's normally 5 guns and a howitzer, but for the sake of clarity, 6 pieces that they were servicing in each of these batteries, and the men to service them, and the men riding the horses, pulling the gun limbers, 65 men, and in a horse artillery troop there would be about 65 horses, and in a field troop there would be about 25 horses. So this is a big group of people. Now, those individuals are in this group. We will come back to the first line artillery ammunition limbers in a minute. So here are our 6 pieces of ordnance, or 6 guns, being dragged up there, and the chaps are servicing the gun. Now, this lot has got to fit in somewhere on the battlefield. If you want to move the guns quickly and get them out of action, then actually you've got to have them somewhere behind the gun. But at Waterloo, it's a very tight battlefield. And actually what we often find, and you'll see in a lot of pictures, is that these guys were behind the 1st or 2nd battalions, or behind the 1st division, or possibly the brigade battalions that's deployed forward. So they were dislocated. And that caused a problem, of course, with ammunition as well. Now, Wellington's comment in his letter was that they ran off the field, taking with them limbers, ammunition, and everything. And this would indicate that he expected this whole group to actually seek refuge within a square. Because otherwise, where else are they going to go? He didn't stipulate just the gunners. He didn't say, take the guns off. And so the order becomes open to a number of interpretations. But if we look at this and the practicalities of this on this slide, you can see those 12 batteries deployed here along the ridge, and you can see the infantry battalions, 36 of them now deployed in square. Now obviously they can't run from this gun to this square. That's about 300 metres. And with these thousands of French cavalrymen thundering down on them, I would suggest that they're not going to do that. They wouldn't have got there. So they're going to go for the front battalions, and it just so happens, although this is laid out diagrammatically, but when you turn from the map where the battalions were and put them into squares pretty much in the ground that they had, I know some of them pulled slightly back onto the reverse slope, you've got about 12 battalions. So let's say, for the sake of argument, you've got to fit in those 65 men, and for a horse artillery, 65 horses, into a square. Well, actually, we know that squares weren't squares, because they had 10 companies, and 10 doesn't go into 4. So actually they were, generally speaking, they were more rectangular than squares, but that's not the important point. The important point is that in the centre of the square of a battalion of 600 odd men, it's only about 10 by 10 metres. That's the central piece of a square. And you can't start to fit 65 gunners and 65 horses or 25 horses into the centre of those squares. Equally, if you're an infantryman and you've formed your square, and you can see the French cavalry coming, are you really going to open your square and allow all these people to come in at that critical moment? Well, I would suggest that you probably wouldn't. And so we can start to see that this actually is an order which was very ambiguous and very questionable from the start. As far, therefore, as the accusation is concerned, Wellington is correct. The gunners didn't seek refuge in every case inside the squares, but I put it to you that the order was pretty strange in the first instance. But let's move on to accusation number 4, that the fact that the gunners had quit the field completely. Now this has been, as I said, vehemently rejected by the Royal Artillery and Royal Artillery historians, and yet my research has uncovered some diaries from the King's German Legion that were published at the start of the 20th century in 1907 that would indicate that they almost certainly did quit the field. At least one KGL battery did, and I've also uncovered evidence of 2 gunner batteries, that Royal Artillery batteries, that probably did the same. The account is Bernard Schwertfeger's account of the King's German Legion, say published in about 1907, 1908, and he produces evidence of the 2 batteries in direct support to the 1st Division that left the field. They're under the command of Colonel Adet, and this is what Schwertfeger wrote in his account. It's quite lengthy, but I think it's worth reading it all out so we've got the facts. During this time, at about 1730 to 1800, a strong, heavy calibre battery deployed about 1,200 paces from our position and fired at us. But we did not return fire because of Wellington's earlier order. I left that in there so that here's a battery that actually did clearly receive that order. Later that afternoon, we realised that the enemy, some distance from us, was making a heavy attack on the left of our lines. but we did not realise how successful this attack was because the progress was masked by the terrain. And afterwards we realised that our lines were broken and that the enemy cavalry had got in behind, unseen by us, and they fell unexpectedly on our left flank and forced us, that is, he puts in brackets, his brackets, the 2 artillery batteries under Lieutenant Colonel Adair, to retreat. After some distance I found some space where other artillery units had arrived along with their personnel and carts, and here it was possible to reorganise, but this took some time. During this time, Colonel Adair arrived with the English battery, which had been driven even further back, and they now joined us at our position, and because that battery had not fired as much as us on the 16th at Quatre Bras, they had given us some ammunition. After this, both batteries under Colonel Adair, as well as the other artillery, this is an important point, as well as the other artillery which had arrived in the same area, returned to their original positions and re-entered the battle. When they arrived back to the battle line, the battle had turned in our favour and the French were retreating. Well, I can only assume that when he talks about returning to the battle and the French retreating, that he's talking about the end of the French cavalry attacks, i.e. at about 1800, something like that, because certainly some of the accounts of the batteries talk about then engaging the Guard. So they're not referring to the sort of back end of the battle at about 1945, 1950. Now, one of these batteries was under the command of Major Jacob Kuhlmann, and indeed Kuhlmann was the author of the letter that Schwertfeger used in that account. The other battery, the other direct support battery to the 1st Division, was the battery under Charles Sandham. We also know from account and another letter to Siborne that a young Lieutenant James Wilson, who said that his battery, that's Sinclair's battery, had done the same thing at about 3 o'clock. Less one gun, he writes. And he's quite specific about that because his senior NCO actually spiked the gun during Derlon's initial attacks at about 13:30 in panic. Now that's evidence enough that complete batteries most certainly did quit the field. 2 of which, based on the eyewitness accounts, were Royal Artillery batteries. Indeed, as I emphasised, the tail end of Kuhlmann's letter would indicate that many other batteries had done the same thing. So clearly, despite protestations from the Royal Artillery, there is no doubt that complete batteries had quit the field. And Wellington must have seen them going. He may not have seen them returning to their positions. But as far as the accusation is concerned, it is a fair accusation. But there is another twist in the tale, and that is the whole business of artillery ammunition resupply that day. And I want to return to the ammunition wagons, and that's this lot down here. And you'll see that although there are 6 guns, 6 pieces of ordnance, there are in fact 9 first-line ammunition wagons, because for each pair of guns, rather confusingly called a division of guns, there were 3 first-line artillery ammunition limbers for a pair of guns. Now, inexplicably, and I've searched this quite thoroughly and not been able to come up with any explanation for it, but I have my own suggestion for it. Inexplicably, ammunition resupply, which normally ran from the rear to the front, in other words, once these wagons had brought their ammunition forward, put it into the immediate ammunition limbers, and once they were empty, these guys were replaced by the second line ammunition, which came to the rear to the front, and then these chaps went back to the rear and bombed up. What was happening at Waterloo was that they were conducting ammunition resupply from the front to the rear. The second line ammunition limbers never came forward. And again, I suspect, but it is my personal view, and certainly for those that have been to the field at Waterloo, You know what a very, very tight field it was for so many soldiers to be conducting a defensive position, that this lot, there was just simply no real space for them. So they would come forward, bomb up the first line or the immediate gun limber boxes, and then go back. And what this would have given Wellington the impression of is an awful lot of rearward movement, more rearward than forward. And again, may have given him the impression that the gunners were spending an awful lot of time going to the rear and not actually getting on with the business of warfare. So, on the face of it, a fair assessment. Certainly with the business of the ammunition resupply, something is not quite right there. But if Wellington had had a good relationship with his artillery commander, his artillery advisor, I'm sure that an explanation could have been forwarded and apposite mitigation provided. Certainly enough to make any accusation that the gunners had quit the field, which was undeniably a suggestion of cowardice, most inappropriate and fundamentally mistaken. Now, there's little doubt that the gunners served Wellington well, both in the Peninsula and at Waterloo. The Commander-in-Chief's motives for penning the letter are quite clear following the debacle at Vittoria. But why he leaves it in his correspondence after 1816, when it had achieved its aim, is slightly less easily dismissed. There's little doubt that the relationship between Wellington and his gunners was seldom harmonious. John Fortescue, the author of the History of the British Army, an excellent work, wrote that the quarrel between the artillery and Wellington, begun by his unceremonious treatment of his senior officers in the Peninsula, continued by his taking away horses from batteries for the pontoon train, embittered by his harshness to Norman Ramsay, and made irreconcilable by his dispatch after Waterloo, renders it difficult to speak of the relations between the two. There can be no doubt that no love was lost between the general and his gunners, but I find it difficult to believe that the faults were one-sided. And indeed, the faults were not one-sided. This Waterloo letter was the culmination of many years of frustration for Wellington, who'd had to be played off in the middle by officers of the artillery and with the Master General of the Ordnance. His determination not to reward a single corps under any circumstances also comes out clearly in the letter. He also, as we all well know, did not want a history of the battle actually written at all. And he goes on in the letter that if it is to be a history, it must be the truth and the whole truth, or it will do more harm than good, and will give as many false notions of what a battle is as other romances of the same description have. But as I say, why Wellington chooses to leave the letter in his correspondence is not clear. The second Duke, when he entered into correspondence with Captain Duncan, who was writing a history of the Royal Artillery at about the time that the supplementary dispatches were being published, wrote to Duncan and said that the Duke's approbation of the Royal Artillery was not unmeasured, and I dare say that the Royal Artillery did not love him. Now, that's an interesting observation, because to be honest, very few of Wellington's soldiers loved him, but they had a great respect for him, and so did, as I found out from all of the eyewitness accounts that I read in my research for Wellington's guns, the gunner officers and gunner soldiers were no exception to that. Thank you very much indeed.
Nick, perhaps you'd be kind enough to take questions.
Absolutely.
I'm not a military man. I've got two questions for you. Why would Wellington order that they didn't engage in counter-battery fire? And what should he have ordered the gunners to do when the cavalry charged?
Yeah, the two very good questions. Let's take the first one then. Okay, why not encounter battery fire? Well, the very simple reason is that we always had a paucity of artillery. The French, Napoleon had a maxim, 5 guns for every 1,000 men on the field of battle. He doesn't achieve it at Waterloo. He's about 3 guns per 1,000. We're at about 1.8 per 1,000. So what Wellington doesn't want to do is to get engaged and embroiled in using his guns to counter the French guns. And the other very simple explanation is that there were a number of very heavy guns on the French side. Our heaviest gun was the 9-pounder, but the French had a 12-pounder gun, which had longer reach. We heard Cavalry Mercer's explanation of that, and that those batteries could cause us more grief than we could cause them any grief. Okay, what should the gunners have done at the cavalry charge? Well, it's a very good question. It's a very difficult question to answer, because I don't have a simple explanation that would solve the problem. But certainly, the order should have been given much more clearly. When the mass charges came, of course, one of the things which we were exceptionally fortunate about is that none of those guns that were left out there on the ridge, those 12 batteries, 72 guns, none of them were spiked by the French cavalry when they were riding around the squares between 4 o'clock and 6 o'clock. So it was exceptionally fortunate. Of course, if you haven't brought the pin, and it's like a large 6-inch nail, in fact it's probably an 8-inch nail, that the cavalry would carry with them, and normally they carried this as a matter of course, and they would just drive this into the back of the gun, into the vent hole, and hammer it in and then break it off, and then the gun was rendered unserviceable until you took it from the field. You could then drill it out again, but of course you're not going to do that in heated battle. And they're exceptionally fortunate that this doesn't happen. What the gunners do, because the other thing you can do, particularly if you're cavalry advancing on your own, although, as I said earlier on, the mark of a good general was that you weave those 3 components together, and this was, of course, one of the French great failings. They kept using single components to do things rather than using the components together in an all-arms capacity, is you can drag the gun away. And it's amazing, of course, the cavalry didn't do that. Well, there's a simple reason for that, and again, it's not well known that what actually the gunners all did was they took the offside wheel off and they rolled it back as well into the squares. So that is yet another reason for the questioning the sense of the order. What Wellington could have done, he could have perhaps thinned out some of the batteries, because when surprise on a Napoleonic battlefield is a relative concept. I mean, things don't happen instantly in the way that they do in modern warfare. And so you could see this massive cavalry forming up. I mean, it didn't suddenly start charging. And actually, cavalry didn't generally charge. It sort of trotted and got into the canter. Because if you went to, you just lost all control. So you could see this thing happening. And it would then depend on where your limbers were. And this was the dilemma of the field at Waterloo. If the limbers were behind your battalion, or your brigades, by the time you got them forward, time was probably against you. But I think he should have anticipated, and it's very easy for me to say that in hindsight, of course, but I think he could have, and a good artillery advisor might have said to him, things are brewing on the horizon, Lord, I think we might bring off some of the guns, and then got some of them back and out of the way, and then given a much clearer order as to what was to happen to the rest. Some of the chaps stayed at their guns. Mercer's battery did, for good reasons, because he felt as though if he ran, the Belgian battalion that was next to him would break and run as well.
Could you give a brief objective assessment of the impact of the rocket troop that were also
Yeah, I mean, Win Yates goes to Waterloo with his rockets. Now, Wellington doesn't like rockets. Wellington is not a technical officer. I mean, one of the things Wellington never really grasped is that he had the greatest force multiplier of any of the armies of the era in his arsenal, and he never uses it properly. And it's what I think is this thing here. which is Shrapnel Shell. The French captured a round at Maida in 1806 and spent the rest of the war trying to replicate the fuse. This is an airburst munition. This really caused enormous problems to the French. I mean, in Wimmera, when it's used on the first time, Ackland's gunners are firing on Kellerman's grenadiers as they're marching up the road, and they could see the battery, but they weren't fussed about it. They would take the consequences of round shot, but suddenly these things were bursting above them, and this black rain, these musket balls and carbine balls were raining down on top of them. And what is interesting about that phrase, that's the exact phrase that the Iraqis used, of course, in the first Gulf War for multiple launch rocket bombers. This black rain coming down. So Wellington's not a technical officer. At the ridge at Busaco, he's already written off shrapnel because General Seymour has brought to him, because he's got shrapnel balls that hadn't really penetrated him, you know, and they were no more than duck shot, as he described it. And this, of course, missed the point. And there were a whole host of technical reasons, because you were firing up on a ridge and an airburst munition. The munition wasn't designed to impart great velocity when it exploded. It uses its inertial velocity for the balls to hit the target. And if it's bursting 100 metres above the target, by the time it hits the target, it's got no velocity, hence the balls didn't penetrate General Seymour's head. But rockets. He plays around with rockets in the peninsula. He doesn't like them. At Santarem, they set fire to the village, which he says, you know, what's the point of having these damn things? You know, this is a village owned and inhabited by our allies, and we're setting fire to it. Then, of course, he doesn't see the rockets doing good service at the crossing of the Adour, because he's already taken the balance of the army over to Toulouse. In the Low Countries in early 1815, Wynne Yates turns up, proud as mustard, with his rocket troop, and they've done good service at Leipzig, of course, where Richard Bogue had been killed. Wynne Yates has got Bogue's troop, and he's happy to be able to take this to the field of battle. But Wellington says, forget that, get him some guns. And eventually, Wood argues the case, and Wellington's just not really too fussed about all the pros and cons. He says he can have some rockets. So he does use rockets at Waterloo. He uses them on the 17th during the withdrawal, and at Guinat he sets up his rockets, and they fire towards the approaching French cavalry. Some of the rockets go, generally speaking, in the direction of the French. Some of them go up, turn, and come back. And we have a couple of eyewitness accounts suggesting that they were more of a danger to the Allies than they were to the approaching French. He also fires some rockets the next day, very close to KINCAID and his boys at the sandpit on the road there next to La Haye-Sault. They were not in the same caliber as Shrapnel Shell. Shrapnel Shell was a force multiplier. The rockets were a bit of an irrelevance, if I'm honest. I think they were probably great in India when you were firing them towards Indian armies or Maratha armies seated on elephants. But I think, really on a modern European battlefield, they were not a weapon of choice.
Two questions. The withdrawing the guns into the squares, is that something that had been used in either previous battles, or was it rehearsed on exercise other than in warfare?
It was rehearsed on Woolwich Common. It was never used in the peninsula. Remember, he wasn't saying take the guns into the squares. He was saying to the gunners, you get in the squares. So, I mean, that's the complication of this order. But guns into squares wasn't an option, and indeed, the original plans for infantry squares was that you put a gun on each corner. And that was part of to enhance the defences. But no is the answer. That wasn't his intention, but it was an option.
So the follow-up question is that the conclusion I come to from the order not to engage in counter-battery fire and his concern that the artillery withdrew from their positions perhaps behind the infantry lines rather than leaving the field, suggests he's just being cavalier with the lives of gunners, and I wondered whether he was equally cavalier with the orders he gave to the other parts of the army, or...
Well, I think it's very unfair to suggest that he was being cavalier with the lives of the gunners. And I remember, I think a lot of responsibility for this must fall on the shoulders of the CRA. I mean, he's there to advise the Commander-in-Chief on what is and what is not possible with his fighting component. And guns have got to be in front of the infantry. And at some stage, when the cavalry attack, a decision has to be made and disseminated and properly disseminated as to where they're to go and when they're to go. And I think that was the problem, is that the order just didn't go down sufficiently clearly enough. And some batteries actually did not know they were to seek shelter within the squares at all, and they stayed at their guns. And I'm not referring to Cavalier Mercer, who did know, he just stayed there, but other batteries didn't move. It's always a dilemma, and a Napoleonic battlefield was a very tight position. I mean, you can stand on 2 or 3 locations and take the whole thing in. I mean, we're not talking about many kilometres of a modern battlefield. And trying to squeeze the guns in, and it was often a squeeze, and there was a bun fight. It was the real estate management issue, as we would call it in the modern army, as to, the cavalry didn't want them in front of them because then they couldn't form up and charge, and they couldn't lay out their mine-tech lines to get the squadrons forward. The infantry, they wanted them, but they didn't really want them in front of them because it disrupted their fire and so on. There were all sorts of problems, and often what you found, particularly, let's go to Talavera, for example, where Wellington only had 6 batteries. He actually had to put sort of half batteries either side of the infantry battalions. And what that really meant is you'd return to a thing called battalion guns, which is what we'd got rid of at the back end of the 18th century. So these were sort of operating as 3s, and really the battalion commander was sort of, giving orders to that half section of guns. So, yeah, I mean, I think it'd be unfair to suggest that he was cavalier with the lives of the gunners.
Were commanders expected to use their initiative, or were they simply there to obey orders?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I think it's on a Napoleonic battlefield, I think it's a bit of both. I think it's a bit of both even today. A direct order, a clear order, like I don't want you to engage in counter-battery fire, I think is unequivocal. But take refuge within the squares, okay, notwithstanding the fact it's an ambiguous order, Mercer decides that actually he's not going to do that. And he decides that he's not going to do that because he really does genuinely believe that if he breaks and runs with his 65 men, that actually a Belgian battalion, which is deployed on his left or right, it must have been on his left, will probably break and run as well, because they hadn't got into squares at that particular juncture. So I think it's a little bit of both. It would be wrong to suggest, well, I think it would be wrong to suggest that you could disobey an order just because you felt as though that your reasons were more apposite to that particular circumstance on the battlefield at the time. And remember, we're talking about small battlefields, so the Commander-in-Chief and his ADCs and immediate staff can actually see things going on pretty quickly. On a modern battlefield, which is spread far and wide, of course, if you're going to make a decision because the enemy have done something and they've changed the way that your orders were given, I think perhaps that's different. But on a Napoleonic battlefield, I think you would have to be pretty clear if you were going to ignore an order or countermand an order of your reasons for so doing. I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, and there are many examples in the Peninsula and at Waterloo where people did, in fact, countermand the orders for good reasons, as we've heard, with Bull's Battery, Bolton's, and Sanders.
I may be wrong, but I was always under the impression that Wellington gave his artillery to his divisional commanders independently under their command. Was it the size of Waterloo that he changed his mind, or was there another reason?
No, he doesn't give them to his divisional commanders, with the exception of Ross's troop, which remained with the Light Division pretty much throughout the Peninsular War. There's only one other battery that remains with one division throughout the peninsula, and that's Lawson's company with the 5th Division. The other batteries move around. He put some horse artillery batteries with infantry units, sometimes with cavalry units and so on. So they were never task organised with particular divisions, with the exception, as I say, of Ross's troop with the Light Division. However, when we get to Vittoria, because we're now beginning to get a few more guns, by Vittoria, there's a big artillery duel, 75 Allied guns against 76 French guns. We've now got these 2 battery commanders, like Colonel Aday, that was commanding the 2 batteries allocated to the 1st Division. We've got these staff officers that are responsible for the 2 batteries. And the only reason they did that is rather like the same reason that Napoleon introduces the Corps d'Armée system, that instead of having 12 divisional headquarters staffs that you've got to write your orders to, you actually fire them out to 3 corps headquarters who've all got their own integral staffs and fire them down. That's on a much grander scale, but on the lower tactical level, that's what it was for. You could get the orders out to a single officer, generally a major or a lieutenant colonel, as it was in this case, and he then gave the orders to the battery commanders. This was not liked by the battery commanders at all, because it took some of their autonomy away, and so they weren't very happy about it at all. But that's how the whole thing worked. And of course we've got his infamous army come Waterloo. He really has to make do with some of his peninsular veterans, some other units that are being moved out from the United Kingdom and Ireland, and he has to make the best of what he's got. So old affiliations generally went by the wayside. He just fitted the batteries in where he could.
At the end of the day, sorry.
Yeah, okay, please.
At the end of the day, when the Imperial Guard advanced, how much artillery was actually left on?
Yeah, this is a really good question, because I've seen Nigel Sells' articles or book on this, and I've spoken to Andrew Field on this, because Andrew made a contribution to the Waterloo book that I edited for Waterloo 200. This is a point which seems to be significantly misunderstood, that there were still 12 batteries firing. Could be more, could be slightly less, but of that sort of order at about 1900 to 2000. Mercer's battery had almost been annihilated by then. They had almost no ammunition left, the gun barrels were cooking off, and there were all sorts of other problems, and not least of which his gunners were being decimated. But there were still 12 subunits, give or take, that were firing at that time, and they were having a significant effect. With this thing, the reach of this, not canister. No. Canister, different thing. Shrapnel is a different thing. Canister is baked bean can, packed with musket balls, bursts on leaving the muzzle like a shotgun, and range 350 yards, for that sort of order. Grape, same sort of thing, but just bigger, ping pong ball size, held together on a little wooden sabot, and with a sacking cloth, again, bursts out. So instead of having on a 9-pounder, you'd have about, with canister, you'd have about 45 musket balls would come out, and with grape, you'd have about 9 to 15, depending on the size of the lead balls. Now,
did they alternate the canister and?
They did not fire grape at all. None of the Royal Artillery batteries fired grape at Waterloo, so we can shove up to the side. But they did, they double shot with spherical case or canister and a round shot. If I could just finish on shrapnel here, what shrapnel was a shell which was the French had, that would land, and it was a sort of Pink Panther-esque bomb, with a big fuse at the top, would land on the floor and fizz around, and the boys had enough time sometimes to either get out of the way of it, or even, and some eyewitness accounts, they dug holes, particularly during sieges, and had enough time to dig a quick hole and shove the thing in and then throw the soil back on top. And they were not very efficient, unless they landed in your trench or your parallel during sieges, then they could cause all sorts of problems. But this thing was the same thing. It's a hollow spherical case, but it had a bursting charge in the middle, And that bursting charge was initiated by a very, very clever fuse invented by Henry Shrapnel, a gunner captain, that enabled the thing to airburst. And so those 40 fragments, including the balls and the fragments of the casing, would come and rain down then on the advancing cavalry, infantry, or indeed above the guns. And there are a couple of eyewitness accounts of complete gun crews being taken out by a shrapnel shell bursting above them. So these things were really, really effective.
I think probably, Nick, time to let you off the hook. I commend you, if I may say so. We started dead on time. You were given 45 minutes as a guide, and you finished dead on time, which of course is what gunners are required to do. Time over target. There's absolute precision in the whole performance. So I really do congratulate you. And I thought there's some really good questions this evening as well. Nick and I were at something called the Wellington Congress at Southampton University over the weekend. You could say a bit of a glutton for punishment. Well, we were, in a way, because despite the fact we were amongst academics and historians, we didn't get a bunch of questions as good as those that we've had this evening. So thank you for your questions. I think, if I may, for the benefit of the audience, we're beginning to master the heating controls in here. Just a little bit cold, maybe, but that's the way I want it. I don't want to see anybody falling asleep. When I gave my first talk here, which some of you were at, I noticed at the back some of the heads in the first half really were on their shoulders, which is actually extremely depressing if you're speaking. So we've got the controls just probably as we want them. I have to say that an admission I think you've heard before, that my father was a gunner, and at one point I was destined to go into the gunners. Now, I'm not saying I had a Damascene vision or anything of that sort. It didn't work like that, because my father said to me, what regiment are you going into? And I said, well, Dad, I'm thinking about the gunners. He said, well, I wouldn't go into the gunners if I were you, because you're no good at trigonometry. Think how things have advanced over recent years. Trigonometry, I don't think you even knew, did you?
Absolutely not, no.
And after all, you've been around for a while, perhaps. Not as long as me. Just two other things before I bring this to a conclusion. You will notice that there are a couple of flyers. Our next sort of venture onto Waterloo is a seminar. And it's a seminar looking at the opposing armies. But there's another seminar coming up on the 30th of May, which Nick alluded to, which is a discussion of the French Imperial Guard, what actually happened during the advance of the French Imperial Guard. And Andrew Field, whom he spoke about, will be putting across the conventional approach to how the Imperial Guard functioned on that day. And then after a copy, Nigel Sale, who some of you will know, will be putting an opposite view, his view of what happened on that day. Nigel Sale later on accuses Wellington of a conspiracy theory and not giving the 52nd Light Infantry their due. I thought actually before tonight that the same might apply to Wellington's approach to artillery, but I think it's differently grounded as a result of today. And you will also notice that our next evening talk is not about Waterloo. There are people out there who are not as interested in Waterloo as they are in other subjects. And so we are returning at our next talk to our theme of the First World War. And it's the first of two talks on the First World War this year, which will lead into further talks, obviously, next year. And my final point is to say you will have heard Nick Lipscombe today, you will have drawn your own conclusions about what a good speaker he is. But he is actually one of the historians and tour guides who will be participating in the Rifles Battlefield Study Tour of Waterloo in September. If you've never been to Waterloo and you're interested in going there for 4 days to see the battlefield and have it all brought to life, Well, this was one of the people who will be doing it. And another one is also in the room, Nick Haynes there. He's also going to be bringing it to life. Now, this is a tour that's being organised by the Rifles, the living regiment, but it is open to people like yourselves, should you be interested. So if you are interested, second half of September, and you'd like a trip to Waterloo, then have a word with me and I will put you in touch with the organiser. So having given all those plugs, I really ought to return to our lecturer today, Nick, and to thank him for his very clear and rounded exposition of the gunners at Waterloo and the Waterloo Letter. Nick, thank you very much indeed. Canapes and wine next door, the usual way.